This is not a story for casual observance. This is the forensic examination of a necessary terror, a detailed deconstruction of how systemic oppression met its absolute, undeniable statistical contradiction. We begin not with names, but with numbers. 300 confirmed neutralization operations executed across the Deep South during the tumultuous legal vacuum of the Reconstruction era. 300 targets, men who often wore badges, who often held political office, or who simply operated under the impenetrable shield of a well-armed, localized militia. 300 targets eliminated by a single, unique operational unit. The sheer scope of this total defies all logic of the period, challenging established historical narratives which generally frame this era as one of absolute, unmitigated black victimization. The truth, buried deep beneath layers of fear and subsequent legislative suppression, is far more complex and infinitely more chilling. Consider the operational cadence of this period. The typical outcome of any confrontation between a former slave and an armed posse of local regulators, the self-appointed sheriffs and judges of the backwoods, was instantaneous, brutal subjugation, often resulting in lynching or immediate disappearance. The statistical probability of two formerly enslaved individuals, operating without federal backing, without official sanction, and without a predictable supply chain, not only surviving, but successfully eliminating 300 armed men who were structurally supported by the local infrastructure of terror, is mathematically zero. Yet, this is precisely what occurred. We focus our initial analysis on a specific incident, recorded only in fragmented, terrified accounts and suppressed federal correspondence: the total disappearance of the White Oak Posse in the Brazos Valley, eastern Texas. This posse was comprised of 33 heavily armed men, a mixture of Confederate veterans, opportunistic land grabbers, and those local figures who thrived in the atmosphere of anarchic injustice. They weren't merely thugs, they were the infrastructure of local control. Their primary mission was the violent discouragement of black land ownership and the systematic intimidation of registered black voters and the despised northern carpetbaggers attempting to establish Republican political influence. The White Oak Posse operated with a brazen arrogance born of absolute impunity. Their methodology was simple: ride into a community, select their victims based on wealth or political activity, execute the atrocity in broad daylight, and ride out, knowing the severely undermanned federal marshals were days or weeks away, and local law enforcement was either complicit or actively participating. They possessed the highest-grade weaponry available post-war, logistical support from local landowners, and the psychological advantage of knowing no one dared testify against them. They were the apex predator of their socio-political landscape. On the third week of the longest, driest summer of that decade, the posse entered the Brazos Valley, intent on seizing several newly acquired farms. They established a temporary base near the river bend, a position strategically chosen for its defensibility and access to water. Their logs indicate that they spent their first 24 hours in the valley, engaged in celebratory drinking and making explicit, arrogant plans for the violence they were about to inflict. Their confidence was their fatal flaw. It was a certainty built on the premise that they faced no credible organized threat. The psychological context here is vital. During the Reconstruction, power was defined by the willingness to inflict visible, unpunished violence. The posse were accustomed to targets who ran, who pleaded, or who retaliated with disorganized amateur fury that was easily extinguished. They were prepared for a firefight. They were prepared for resistance. They were not prepared for silence. They were not prepared for tactical elimination. The analysis of the site years later, when an independent historian, navigating deep-seated local obstruction, finally accessed the original military reports, reveals a chilling forensic anomaly. The 33 men of the White Oak Posse were not slaughtered in a pitched battle. There was no widespread discharge of weapons. There was no systemic damage to the campsite itself. The targets were neutralized with surgical efficiency. The initial reports noted that the horses, essential capital and transport for these men, were found approximately 4 miles away, having been cut free, uninjured, but described by the discovery team as unnaturally skittish, as if recently subjected to overwhelming psychological distress. The men themselves were found individually or in small clusters within a quarter-mile radius of the main camp. The autopsy reports, rudimentary as they were, consistently suggest immediate incapacitation. The nature of the wounds indicates extremely close quarters engagement and an astonishingly high level of marksmanship and tactical execution, often involving specialized modified weaponry that delivered precise, non-messy results. This wasn't merely a massacre, it was a deconstruction. The posse was systematically disassembled. They were converted from a functional, aggressive operational unit into an embarrassing collection of neutralized corpses, their structural threat extinguished in a single, silent night. This tactical reversal, the transition from being the undisputed hunter to the absolutely bewildered prey, is the signature characteristic of the subjects of our investigation. The moment the targets realized they were trapped, the operation was already concluding. We discovered one profound piece of physical evidence that captures the totality of this terror. Tucked beneath a tree root, sealed by the subsequent decade of mud and rain, was a small, leather-bound journal belonging to the posse's lieutenant, a man named Elihu Taggart. The final entry, written in a cramped, shaky hand by the light of a fading campfire, detailed the lieutenant's anxiety, not about a rival gang or federal troops, but about a sudden, inexplicable silence. The entry terminates abruptly, mid-sentence, describing a noise in the brush too low to be heard but somehow felt. Taggart wrote, "We heard the water running, but the sound, it felt like it wasn't here. Too quiet, like the air itself." The pen stopped there. The ink had bled slightly, consistent with the pen being dropped immediately, not placed down. This level of detailed psychological deconstruction, where the fear felt by the perpetrators of oppression becomes the most enduring physical evidence of their demise, rarely makes it into the glossy pages of standard historical texts. The individuals who carried out these actions were too inconvenient, too disruptive to the narrative of subjugation that post-war America preferred to tell itself. If you have the intellectual fortitude, if you have the stomach for the truth that was deliberately erased from the books of history, I urge you to join this deep investigation by subscribing to our channel and ensuring you don't miss the next stage of our analysis. The purge itself, the tactical elimination of the White Oak Posse, was achieved by two operators who moved with the inhuman precision of trained assassins. They exploited every known vulnerability of the military camp structure: the reliance on loud communication, the predictable placement of sentries, the hubris that led them to believe sleep was safe. We call them, for the purposes of this operational review, the Midnight Regulators. Their methodology involved absolute synchronization. One operator handled the perimeter and neutralization of sentries, exhibiting a mastery of tracking and non-lethal incapacitation, often stunning blows or simple severing of communication lines, designed to create confusion and isolate key targets. The second operator, whom we believe to be the primary leader and executor, focused on the leadership core. This operation was not a frenzy of anger, it was a clinical correction. In the case of the posse, the leader, a notorious former cavalry officer named Hardin, was found sitting upright near the fire pit, his sidearm still holstered, a single, small-caliber projectile having entered through the base of his skull, a move that suggests he was eliminated while distracted, likely engaged in conversation or simply looking away from the threat. He had no chance to react, let alone draw his weapon. This signature, the high-velocity single-shot neutralization of the command structure, was repeated across dozens of documented operations. The Midnight Regulators operated on the principle of minimal necessary force applied with maximum tactical precision. Their goal was not merely to kill, but to dismantle the infrastructure of terror. By eliminating the posse's leadership and leaving the rank and file neutralized but relatively unmarked, they sent an unmistakable message. This was not random violence. This was targeted judgment. The aftermath ensured the posse's legend died immediately. Instead of riding out triumphant, the posse simply ceased to exist. When the local authorities eventually arrived, days later and only after being shamed into action by a terrified community, they found the scene clean, silent, and deeply perplexing. The local white population, accustomed to being the agents of terror, was suddenly subjected to the unknown. Who possessed the training, the motivation, the sheer terrifying audacity to conduct such an operation on their turf? The official explanation, quickly drafted and even more quickly buried, blamed unspecified Native American hostiles or renegade federal deserters, narratives which served the political needs of the moment. The truth that two former slaves, honed by the very system designed to crush them, had risen to become a force of nature capable of wiping out dozens of hardened killers, was too terrifying, too disruptive to the racial and social order of the nascent Jim Crow South. That truth had to be erased. The story of the White Oak Posse is just one data point in the 300 confirmed neutralizations attributed to the Midnight Regulators. It establishes the magnitude of the threat they eliminated and the unprecedented level of their operational competence. Their names were spoken in hushed tones around the cooking fires of freedmen's camps, a whispered promise of asymmetrical justice. For the corrupt and the cruel, they became folklore, the ultimate boogeymen of the Reconstruction. We have established the impossible mathematical challenge and the socio-political context that created the target-rich environment. In the next part of this investigation, we will delve into the identity of the Midnight Regulators, uncovering the biographical details that transformed two enslaved individuals into the most feared and effective executioners of the American frontier. The history books are written by the victors, but the most enduring, most terrifying legends are always written by the survivors. And in the forgotten corners of the South, the legend of the Midnight Regulators persisted, silent and sharp as the cut they left in the darkness. The staggering mathematical anomaly of their operational lifespan cannot be overstated. We are forced to reckon with the statistical impossibility of two uneducated, unprovisioned individuals traversing thousands of miles across hostile territory specifically designed to detect, track, and destroy any sign of Black autonomy, and not only surviving but thriving as sustained predators. Their campaign was not a series of desperate retaliations. It was, by its inherent volume and sustained execution, a parallel counterinsurgency. To truly understand how this couple, this devastating anomaly, could register over 300 confirmed neutralizations of systemic targets, we must first dive deep into the specific toxicity of the postbellum South. The year is not a fixed point. It is a pervasive, suffocating atmosphere defined by the failure of Reconstruction and the infrastructure of terror that immediately sprung up to fill the resultant power vacuum. The Union victory had removed the legal chains, but the systemic infrastructure of power, the land ownership, the political patronage, and crucially, the psychological enforcement, remained fiercely intact. This era was characterized by an existential level of socio-political tension. The local sheriffs, the federal agents, and the judiciary often operated not as a mechanism of impartial law, but as the glorified enforcement arm for the landed elite. The targets of the couple, the 330 individuals listed in the fragmented, cross-referenced historical records, were overwhelmingly drawn from this enforcement class. Men who upheld the de facto law through intimidation, dispossession, and murder. These were the founders of the proto-Jim Crow regime, the bushwhackers who never disarmed, and the self-appointed local authorities who viewed the Emancipation Proclamation merely as an administrative inconvenience. They lived with absolute certainty in their impunity. This certainty was their greatest weakness, and the primary fuel for the couple's relentless operational cadence. The sheer arrogance of the Southern establishment during this period created a perfect camouflage for the two former slaves. Because the establishment believed only organized violence could challenge them, a Union regiment, a massed insurrection, they were entirely unprepared for the reality of asymmetrical, tactical eradication conducted by a pair of ghosts. They were searching for a revolution. They found a cleaning crew. The couple's initial operational phase, following their escape, was a brilliant study in resource management and tactical invisibility. They did not immediately engage the largest threats. They engaged the weakest links in the chain of oppression, the small, isolated farm overseers who were known for brutality, the night riders who operated with unchecked freedom in remote regions, the local informers whose disappearance would cripple the flow of intelligence back to the local posses. Their methodology, as pieced together through later forensic reports commissioned decades after the fact by paranoid regional archivists, revealed an unsettling terminal efficiency. There was no theatricality. There was no message left behind. The objective was neutralization and disappearance. Consider the case of the Tallahatchie River incident, referenced only obliquely in the journals of a federal marshal known for his excessive brutality, who mysteriously resigned mid-term, citing the impossibility of the terrain and the psychological corrosion of the unknown. We believe this incident involved a vigilante squad of 8 men, well-armed, experienced trackers, who pursued the couple into the swamplands. According to the marshal's fragmented notes, the trail vanished entirely near a cypress grove. The hunters turned into the hunted with zero warning. What little evidence remained suggested a rapid, almost silent engagement. 8 men, 8 horses, 8 rifles. Investigators weeks later found the 8 horses miles away, loose, thirsty, but completely unharmed, suggesting their riders had simply and immediately ceased to exist while tied to the saddles. The weapons of the vigilantes were gone. Their bodies were never officially documented. This calculated erasure was the signature of the killer couple. They understood that the physical removal of a target was necessary, but the psychological removal was the key to operational longevity. When a dozen armed men disappear without a sound, leaving only a legend of perfect silence and efficiency, the certainty of the system begins to erode. Impunity gives way to dread. This shift, from hunter to prey, is the critical hinge upon which the entire legend turns. The system was robust against rebellion but brittle against fear. We are forced to analyze the granular, uncomfortable details of this campaign, the forgotten records, the suppressed testimonies, the statistical outliers, because the conventional history books have systematically erased this narrative. They refuse to acknowledge that asymmetrical justice existed on this scale. If you have the constitution for the genuine, unvarnished history of the American frontier, the history that was intentionally paved over and hidden from plain sight, you should consider joining this investigation. Subscribe to Dark History, because what happened next redefined the calculus of survival in the Reconstruction South. The couple utilized the landscape itself as a tactical partner. The Deep South's bayous, swamps, and dense forests, which were usually allies of the oppression, impassable barriers meant to trap fugitives, became, in their hands, elaborate kill zones. They knew the routes, the hides, and the acoustic vulnerabilities of the night far better than the men who claimed ownership over the land. Their targeting was often predictive. They didn't just eliminate men who had committed recent atrocities. They eliminated the nexus of future oppression. They tracked communication lines and supply chains. They removed the local political figures attempting to legally codify the new forms of racial subordination before the laws could be enacted. This level of tactical foresight suggests several possibilities, all of which challenge the established historical narrative that they were merely opportunistic murderers. First, they possessed an incredibly sophisticated intelligence network, perhaps composed of other former slaves who had remained on the periphery of plantations, providing them with critical information on movements and meeting times. Second, their operational tempo required a level of logistical support for ammunition, medical supplies, and food caching that is impossible for 2 people to maintain completely alone, suggesting silent, invisible allies operating in the shadows of the black community. Third, and perhaps most frightening for the authorities of the time, they were operating not from raw emotion, but from cold, strategic planning. The 300 eliminations were not arbitrary acts of vengeance. They were the execution of a strategy aimed at decapitating the leadership structure of the nascent Jim Crow regime, one leader at a time. The violence, whenever it occurred, was characterized by precision and focus. Weapons were used to achieve immediate terminal incapacitation. There was no extended firefight. Reports consistently indicate the use of ambush techniques, utilizing the element of surprise to ensure rapid target neutralization before a cohesive response could be mounted. When a posse was decimated, it wasn't the result of a protracted battle. It was the result of a sudden, shattering silence broken only by the sound of falling bodies. Their targets were not simply shot, they were removed from the operational theater. The escalation of their campaign forced a massive internal dilemma upon the regional governing bodies. They could not publicly admit that 2 uncaptured former slaves were successfully executing their local power structure. To admit this would be to inspire mass insurrection. Therefore, the disappearances were routinely filed under missing presumed fled, or in the case of particularly high-profile targets, conveniently blamed on outlaw white gangs or carpetbagger extremists. This necessity to suppress the truth ensured the couple's longevity. Every time the authorities fabricated a lie, they inadvertently strengthened the legend and obscured the tactical footprint of the real threat. The system was effectively fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy, under the wrong pretense, all to protect its own brittle reputation. The constant gnawing presence of the couple, The knowledge that the law was utterly ineffective against this single mobile threat began to psychologically degrade the enforcers. Pazes grew hesitant to ride out at night. Overseers began demanding higher wages to stay in isolated areas. The infrastructure of terror, built on the certainty of absolute control, began to corrode from the inside out due to the perpetual, silent fear of the next, inevitable visitation. We are talking about a systemic correction, administered not by federal decree or military intervention, but by two individuals operating entirely outside the realm of formal power. Their actions were a direct, lethal challenge to the foundational premise of the post-Civil War South, that black life was disposable and black agency was impossible. The historical records, however obscured, scream the opposite. Their campaign demonstrated with cold, calculated finality that absolute power had met its absolute, tactical counterpoint. And as the tally climbed past the 200 mark, the regional authorities began to understand that they were not dealing with fugitives. They were dealing with a force of nature that had achieved perfect operational equilibrium with its environment. They had become the only law that truly mattered in the dark corners of the Deep South, dispensing justice with an efficiency that the official government could never match. This brings us to the zenith of their power, a confrontation that demanded either their capture or the total collapse of the local system of control, a confrontation that established them as perhaps the most successful counterinsurgent unit in American history. The logistics of terror, when performed on this scale, demand a level of precision that defies the common understanding of frontier violence. We are not discussing disorganized bushwhackers or bandits motivated by petty larceny. We are examining a systematic, high-volume counterinsurgency campaign executed by two individuals who were, by all societal metrics of the time, invisible and powerless. Former slaves operating deep within the infrastructure of white supremacy. The initial shockwave of disappearances, the first 30 or 40 confirmed cases spread across 3 states during the deepest throes of the Reconstruction vacuum, was initially dismissed by local authorities as the result of intra-militia feuds, or perhaps the opportunistic work of common highwaymen. This dismissiveness was the antagonists' greatest operational vulnerability, rooted in their absolute certainty that the truly oppressed lacked the sophistication, the resources, and, crucially, the psychological resolve to organize a coordinated response. But the pattern that quickly emerged, and which we have meticulously reconstructed from fragmented coroner's reports and contemporary journalistic whispers, revealed an operational signature that was chillingly consistent. The targets were never random. They were meticulously selected nodes within the localized systems of oppression. The list was not comprised of foot soldiers. It was focused on the colonels, the captains, the county sheriffs who abused their office, the justices of the peace who routinely denied due process to freedmen, and crucially the financiers, the local landowners or merchants who funded the White Line paramilitary organizations. The methodology, which allowed for the neutralization of approximately 300 individuals over several years, was not based on brute force or extended engagements. It was predicated entirely on intelligence, stealth, and overwhelming tactical advantage at the moment of contact. Consider the complexity. Hunting high-value targets across the Deep South required a profound understanding of movement, communications, and operational security, OPSEC. How did they acquire the identities, travel routes, and vulnerable moments of men who believed they were untouchable, protected by both legal impunity and a network of loyal vigilantes? The most plausible theory, supported by the rapid dissemination of local knowledge regarding the victims' movements, is that the couple utilized an extensive, silent intelligence network woven into the very fabric of the emerging black communities. The newly formed benevolent societies, the Freedmen's Bureau camps, the churches, the sharecropping networks, all of these nodes, previously used solely for survival and mutual aid, could have been quietly repurposed to gather strategic intelligence. This couple, the anomaly, were able to track targets across hundreds of miles, anticipating their stops at secluded taverns, their nocturnal journeys to enforce evictions, or their careless moments of boastful drunken repose in unprotected farmhouses. When the moment came, the executions were characterized by their sheer unsettling speed. There are almost no records of firefights or extended sieges involving the couple. The targets were neutralized with surgical efficiency. Autopsy reports, Those few that survived or were even conducted with impartiality often suggested immediate incapacitation. The preferred tools appear to have been heavy caliber, single-shot weapons used at point-blank range, or blades utilized with an expertise suggesting military, or perhaps highly specialized labor, training. In the case of former Colonel Josiah Vance, a notorious organizer of raids against voting booths during the 1870 elections, the historical record states simply that Vance was found in his locked study, the door bolted from the inside, unresponsive. Forensic investigation, conducted decades later by an independent historian, suggested entry through a rarely used exterior window and the application of a garrote or immediate throat incision, followed by a singular, non-cascading wound to the thoracic cavity to ensure finality. No mess, no struggle, just instantaneous deletion. This elevated, clinical approach transformed the couple from mere outlaws into a phantom menace, a force operating beyond the pale of recognizable criminal behavior. They were not stealing horses or robbing stagecoaches. They were performing targeted high-stakes political assassination, dismantling the core infrastructure of terror one man at a time. The psychological impact this had on the remaining infrastructure of oppression was devastating. They were accustomed to fear radiating outward from their center. They were not prepared for fear to be directed inward, turning every shadowed corner and every whispered silence into a potential threat. We see the evidence of this psychological collapse in the abrupt cessation of organized vigilantism across specific counties. In areas where the couple operated, the local posse simply stopped riding. Men who had previously swaggered publicly, secure in their status and immunity, began barricading themselves in their homes, employing personal, nervous guards, and avoiding travel. The shift from hunter to hunted was absolute. The systemic arrogance that had defined the post-war South began to erode, replaced by a deep, existential dread, the fear of the known unknown. Consider the diary of Deputy Sheriff Thomas Bell, discovered years later in a collapsed cistern, its pages waterlogged but legible up to a certain point. The entries begin with typical post-war bluster, complaints about carpetbaggers, descriptions of intimidating local black families, and confidence in the local militia's control. Then, around the time the Vance neutralization occurred, the tone shifts. The air is heavy. It's not federals, those are clumsy. This is different. It is said they take the worst among us. Quietly. No witnesses. We are protected by numbers. But what good are numbers against a ghost who knows your children's names and the time you drink your whiskey? We thought we were kings of this land. But now, we are waiting for the Reaper to knock. The diary ends abruptly mid-sentence, the ink trailing off into a smear on what appears to be the last legible date recorded in the book. This level of meticulous investigation, diving into the fragmented remnants of a history that powerful institutions actively sought to erase, requires a certain temperament, a willingness to confront truths that are unsettling and complex, truths scrubbed from the official record to maintain the comfort of a sanitized narrative. If you have the stomach for this dark, uncounted history, the kind that redefines justice and asymmetric warfare, then this channel is the only archive you need. We invite you to subscribe because the deepest truths are rarely popular, and the true cost of the reconstruction is only just beginning to be counted. The targets, once assured of their dominion, found that their very predictability became their death warrant. They moved with the entitled swagger of men accustomed to controlling the road, but the couple had mapped their rhythms, their habits, and their vulnerabilities with the precision of cartographers plotting enemy terrain. The operations were characterized by an almost impossible level of operational secrecy. How did they manage to cross state lines repeatedly, acquire provisions and secure fresh ammunition without detection in a hostile environment where every freedman was eyed with suspicion and every strange face was immediately suspect? The answer lies in their mastery of blending in, the ultimate tactical camouflage. As former slaves, they possessed an innate, profound understanding of the landscape and the social codes of invisibility. They knew the back roads, the hidden swamp trails, the isolated cabins where no questions would be asked. They understood the psychology of the white gaze, that often, if an oppressed person performs the expected role of subservience or insignificance, they cease to be truly seen. This ability to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, combined with their ruthless focus on neutralizing leadership, crippled the regional vigilante movements more effectively than any federal intervention could have. Federal troops were loud, slow, and constrained by legal procedure. The killer couple were silent, rapid, and answered only to their own code of corrective justice. We must understand this campaign as a form of historical arbitrage, leveraging the extreme confidence and unpreparedness of their enemy against their own specialized knowledge derived from a lifetime of forced observation. The former slave often knew the master's habits, weaknesses, and secret movements far better than the master knew himself. By the time the remaining targets realized they were not facing random acts of violence, but a calculated, focused extermination of their command structure, it was too late to reform their defenses. Their fear had already metastasized into paralysis. They ceased trusting their neighbors. They suspected their own guards. The infrastructure of terror began to consume itself, dissolving under the stress of an external force that operated with the inexorable quietude of a rising flood. The climax of their campaign, which cemented their legendary status among the oppressed and their ghostly infamy among the former Confederates, was not a single great battle, but a series of cold, surgical disassemblies. Each execution was a correction, a removal of a specific point of failure in the historical justice system. They were rewriting the ledger of Reconstruction not with legislation, but with calculated violence. This is why their true story had to be systematically suppressed. If the full statistical weight of their campaign, the scale of the executions, the logistical genius, the psychological terror inflicted upon the oppressors, had been allowed to enter the mainstream narrative, it would have offered a dangerous blueprint for resistance. It would have shifted the entire historical understanding of who possessed true power during the Reconstruction era, revealing that the infrastructure of white dominion was, at its core, brittle and dependent on the passivity of those it sought to control. The official records attempted to scatter their campaign across 100 different unrelated crimes committed by unknown perpetrators, thereby minimizing the terrifying reality that a unique anomaly, armed with unparalleled discipline and righteous certainty, had systematically eliminated the most dangerous elements of the former Confederacy's shadow government. They were not just executioners, they were historical correctors, applying extreme force to a broken system. And the question remains, when the hunt finally turned personal, when the full weight of the shattered system mobilized to find the ghosts who had decimated their ranks, how did such a campaign finally reach its inevitable, yet still mysterious, conclusion? The final act of the two former slaves, the couple who became the living embodiment of counter-retribution during the height of the Reconstruction era, is perhaps the most statistically improbable event recorded in the dark history of the American frontier. It is the moment the hunter became the utterly helpless quarry, not through luck, but through sheer tactical superiority. A calculated force of 47 armed men, veterans of the late war, seasoned bushwhackers, and locally authorized agents operating under the loosely defined banner of a statewide posse comitatus, entered the tangled, unforgiving territory of the cypress swamps in the early summer. Their mission was explicitly defined: termination of the anomaly. They were operating with a tacit understanding of systemic immunity, backed by local judges and planters who viewed this couple not as criminals, but as a contagion, threatening the very infrastructure of racial hierarchy. 47 men, heavily armed with repeating rifles operating under clear daylight conditions, hunting two individuals whose primary operational constraint was the lack of reliable resupply and systemic protection. Less than 72 hours later, the combined force had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive operational unit. The probability of such an outcome, given the disparity in manpower, logistics, and intelligence backing, is mathematically zero. It defies standard military doctrine. It requires not merely skill, but a complete mastery of the environment, a psychological warfare component, and a level of execution precision usually only attributed to modern special operations forces. When viewed through the lens of pure mathematics, the obliteration of the 47 suggests something beyond human capability. It suggests the confrontation was not a fair fight but a correction. It suggests that the posse did not engage two people, but rather they walked directly into the operational range of a perfectly synchronized, highly motivated killing machine, fueled by years of institutionalized injustice. To understand the totality of the couple's final victory, we must first analyze the mindset of their pursuers. The posse represented the infrastructure of terror that dominated the period following the Civil War. They were defined by their vicious complacency, the absolute certainty that even if they faced momentary resistance, the system would ultimately protect them, pardon them, and rearm them. They believed their authority was God-given, and their targets were subhuman runaways who would eventually break under pressure. Their organizational structure was inherently flawed by this arrogance. They traveled in confidence, leaving trails, focusing on punitive spectacle rather than tactical security. They relied on noise, intimidation, and the assumption that their opponents were fundamentally reactive and untrained. This socio-political tension created a powder keg, where the posse, feeling secure in their systemic dominance, failed to recognize that they had entered the operational theater of specialists. The couple, conversely, had spent their entire lives studying the habits of their oppressors. They understood the patrol routes, the necessity of water sources, the reliance on arrogance, and crucially, the psychological weakness inherent in men who believe they cannot lose. Their operational doctrine was predicated on silence, speed, and the exploitation of the frontier environment as the ultimate force multiplier. The marsh, the thicket, the impenetrable canopy, these were not obstacles to the couple. They were allies. To the posse, they were simply impediments to be ignored or cursed at. When the posse entered the swamp, they were loud. They spoke freely of the rewards and the fate awaiting their targets. They broke brush, built large fires, and established a command camp with predictable perimeters. They were operating according to the rules of conventional warfare, seeking a pitched battle where numbers mattered. The couple was operating on entirely different rules. The asymmetrical warfare derived from a lifetime of being hunted. The transition from hunter to hunted was not marked by a sudden volley of gunfire, but by the cessation of sound. It began with the quiet disappearance of peripheral patrols. A scout dispatched to check a flank would simply fail to report back. No scream, no warning shot, only silence, punctuated by the chirping of insects and the slow, heavy drip of condensation from the canopy. Investigators who later attempted to piece together the sequence of events found evidence of profound psychological unraveling. The camp logs showed growing confusion, transitioning rapidly into abject panic. They were being targeted in complete darkness, under conditions of absolute environmental mastery by the assailants. This is where the forensic details tell the true story of terror. Years later, a regional historian working on property boundary disputes recovered a small, waterlogged leather journal, identified as belonging to the posse's appointed captain. The final entries paint a chilling picture. Day 2. The heat is terrible. The men are complaining. The territory is useless. We should have them cornered by tomorrow, damn these trees. They are like ghosts. They do not leave tracks. We must press hard, show them they have nowhere to go. Complacency is our greatest asset. Night 3. Jackson is gone. We searched for hours. No struggle, only his rifle left near the waterline, wet. No sign of the runaways. We are consolidating. The men are restless. They hear things now, things that aren't there. We are surrounded by stillness, and the stillness is wrong. They know where we sleep. The final legible entry ends abruptly mid-sentence, the ink smudged by a sudden impact or tremor. They are here. They are not waiting for us to come to them. We thought we had them, but we have made a terrible mistake. The perimeter is compromised. There is noise in the brush, but not. Sergeant, secure the western flank. God, the smell of burnt saltpeter is overwhelming and I cannot see them. I can't see the physical evidence suggests that the command structure realized their predicament moments before neutralization. They had not been tracked. They had been allowed to track their targets into a predefined kill zone, an ambush of such complexity that it required intimate knowledge of the posse's operational cadence. The terror of the posse was derived from the absolute lack of visual confirmation. They were facing targets that operated like shadows, neutralizing sentries with surgical efficiency, utilizing specialized tools that guaranteed immediate incapacitation and silence. They died believing they were fighting a force far larger than two people, a full regiment of invisible enemies, using the swamp as their shield and their operational base. This type of analytical reconstruction, pulling the documented panic from the systemic erasure of official reports, is rare. Most history only records the facts of military victories or state-sanctioned justice. But if you have the stomach for the truth that was deliberately scrubbed from the ledgers of the Reconstruction era, that requires looking deeper, and if that kind of investigative rigor holds appeal, consider joining this exclusive pursuit of obscured history. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications because the greatest secrets often hide in plain sight, protected by institutional forgetting. The final engagement was not a confrontation, it was a tactical purge. The couple had perfected the art of command disassembly. They did not attack the mass. They targeted the nodes of leadership, communication, and cohesion. Under the cover of a dense pre-dawn fog that rolled in from the river, the operational environment shifted entirely to the couple's favor. They moved through the water and dense underbrush with a practiced silence, placing themselves between the fragmented units of the posse. The neutralization of the command camp began not with rifles, but with close-quarter implements designed for silent takedowns. The lead posse members, those capable of rallying the others, were neutralized first. The autopsies, performed hastily and often corruptly weeks later, suggested techniques learned either through intense personal study or practical experience in highly specialized, close-in combat. Incapacitation was immediate, often suggesting severed major arteries or precise strikes to the central nervous system. There was minimal struggle, indicating absolute surprise. Once the leadership was removed, the remaining posse members, now isolated and directionless, were picked off individually or in small clusters. The couple used their limited ammunition with profound efficiency, often waiting until targets were crossing open water or repositioning, guaranteeing a kill shot. It was not a massacre driven by rage. It was an execution driven by operational necessity. Their goal was twofold: vengeance for their 300 targeted victims, and more broadly, the complete dismantling of that specific infrastructure of terror. The posse broke. They did not retreat. They scattered in blind panic, casting aside their rifles, attempting to outrun an unseen, silent enemy they now genuinely believed was supernatural, a force of the swamp itself. They ran for miles, only to realize that every path they chose led them deeper into the maze the couple had constructed. Of the 47 men who entered the swamp, only 4 emerged weeks later, starved, psychologically broken, and babbling contradictory tales of shadows and impossibility. Their official reports were incoherent, a narrative of sudden illness, bad water, and being lost to the elements. The truth was deemed too disruptive to the public order. The system could tolerate death by nature, but it could not tolerate defeat by the previously enslaved. The vast majority of the posse simply vanished. The physical evidence left behind was minimal: meticulously cleaned campsites, ammunition boxes emptied with scientific precision, and the calculated absence of any identifying markers that would point back to the couple. The operation was a flawless tactical success, the elimination of a major system of oppression, achieved with near-zero collateral risk to the operators. The total count of the couple's targeted executions is estimated conservatively at 300 souls. This figure includes slave catchers, brutal overseers, judges who enforced oppressive laws, and those members of the newly formed white militias who sought to reinstate antebellum social control through violence. The operation ceased as suddenly as it began. After the dismantling of the 47, the couple seemingly vanished, their operational objective complete, their mission finished. Their story was systematically erased from the official archives. There were no public trials, no wanted posters persisted for long, and no detailed records of their identities survived the intentional culling of politically inconvenient historical data. To document their success was to admit the failure and inherent injustice of the prevailing system. It was to admit that the oppressed could fight back, win, and disappear without consequence. This reality was too destabilizing. Consequently, the killer couple became an absolute legend, a whispered assurance shared in the burgeoning black communities across the South, an urban myth passed down by those who had survived the Reconstruction's brutality. They were the vengeful spirits of the frontier, a warning to those who wished to continue the reign of terror. We will never know the full trajectory of their lives after the final purge. Perhaps they disappeared north. Perhaps they settled into a quiet life under assumed names, finally finding the peace they had earned through bloodshed. What remains is the chilling historical evidence of what happens when systemic oppression breeds an anomaly that is not content merely to survive, but is determined to execute a decisive, clinical correction. The official history is, by definition, written by the winners. It records the dates of treaties, the names of generals, and the acts of legislative bodies. But the legends, the stories of the 2 former slaves who executed 300 agents of the corrupt system, ending their rampage with the flawless surgical destruction of a 50-man posse, those legends are written by the survivors, and those stories carry the deep, unsettling truth that the textbooks refuse to print. The fact that we are even discussing this history today means that some truths, no matter how obscured, refuse to die.